Hello, this is Dr. Carney, and this is a brief introduction to the academic essay, its rhetoric, organization, and tone. So there's a lot that we can say about the academic essay, but this is just going to be a brief introduction for your reference. So the first thing I want to talk about is the rhetorical strategy and persuasive style of the academic essay. And some of this information comes from a very ancient text, Aristotle's Rhetoric. I have a cover of the Dover Thrift edition here. So what is the argumentative strategy and persuasive style of the academic essay? Aristotle identifies three appeals to persuade. The first one is pathos, appeal to emotion, our fears, our hopes, our desires. You can imagine like a politician stirring up his base in order to, get elected. That's an appeal to emotion. Don't think that's necessarily the appeal of the argumentative strategy of an academic essay. So let's move on to ethos. Ethos, is an appeal to credibility or credentials. Do academics rely upon ethos appeals? I think sometimes they do. We credential ourselves with degrees, and we put PhD next to our names for this reason or that. But I think if you pushed people into a corner, they would, maybe disagree that they're making ethos appeals in their scholarship and their academic writing. That really what they want to be relying upon is this last one, which is logos, appeal to reason. And the argument that we're making, the reason why it's persuasive is not because of who I am. It's not because I've, stirred you emotionally. It's because it's a logical, it's a reasoned argument. But there are different types of reasoning. Deductive reasoning is, more like the mathematical reasoning. You start with certain assumptions, and that are we all accept, and then you make inferences based upon those assumptions, and you develop those inferences to principles and laws. So, you can think of a paper of mathematical analysis. An academic paper looking at a mathematical principle would probably be using deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning in my discipline, literary studies, is probably more common. This is generalized principles are derived from specific observations, evidence, data, information. So I'll use the example of a essay analyzing a work of literature or a poem. You have to read the poem. You have to read the novel and see what's going on in that poem or novel. And you'll quote specific passages from the poem, or you'll quote passages from the novel, and you'll provide commentary on those passages. And maybe you have an argument you want to make about a novel or a poem. Well, you have to deploy evidence to back up any claims that you make. So to summarize, the argumentative strategy and persuasive style of the academic essay, to some extent, I think it's fair to say, is based upon appeals to logos. Of course, depending upon discipline, there's going to be more leeway to or not to use different appeals. A lot of humanities scholarship might operate on the level of pathos every now and again, like an opening anecdote to kind of get the reader into a state of hospitality to an argument. So moving on, the organization of the academic essay is probably, if you're an undergraduate student, you're familiar with this. You've heard something like the 5-paragraph essay. By the way, essays are rarely 5 paragraphs, so it's more just an example. Essays tend to be much longer than that in the university setting. So, I would get rid of this idea of the 5-paragraph essay and maybe just think of more of a 5-paragraph essay structure, right? All the examples include 5 paragraphs, but it can be much longer than that. But academic essays tend to be organized in this introduction, body, conclusion way. I like the analogy of an hourglass structure. So, the introduction is the first, the top bell of the hourglass. Then you have the neck of the hourglass. Then you have the bottom bell. So what does the introduction do? Looking at this visual here, it has general statements, preliminaries. Then you would have a thesis statement, your argument written in a compressed and direct way. And then, of course, you might even provide an outline of how you're going to prove your thesis, how you're going to execute your thesis. Maybe you organize your essay in three different parts, and your introduction might front load those three parts to provide a map for your reader. The body includes multiple paragraphs. There's this issue called paragraph unity, right? Paragraphs should be unified. What does that mean? They should have a topic sentence, a summary of what the paragraph contains. Any sort of claim in the paragraph should be supported by sentences, and then paragraphs, in order to be unified, should have a conclusion. Oftentimes that concluding sentence in a paragraph doubles as a transition. Transition meaning language to signal that you're moving on to a new topic that is connected. And writing effective transitions is an art in itself. So body is composed of paragraphs. Paragraphs should be unified, and then in order to bind paragraphs together into a cohesive essay, you want to have those transitions. And then there's the conclusion of the academic essay. The conclusion often does just restate the thesis, summarizes the main points, and provides a final comment. And what you do with that final comment can vary from discipline to discipline. I personally prefer the final comment to be something along the lines of opening up conversation. What is the significance of what I've just proved? Are there any questions that future scholars might want to respond to? Think about the conclusion as an opportunity to open up the conversation for newcomers who have followed behind. So then the tone. This is probably the most subjective element of the academic essay. First, tone is an acoustic metaphor. We talk about the tone of a voice. We also talk about an author's voice. These are loose analogies, so they're really hard to pin down to make concrete. For example, we often will talk about the academic essay should have an appropriately academic tone. Well, what is an appropriately academic tone? I think that's something that you have to figure out for yourself. Maybe ask your professor. Some professors' definition of an academically appropriate tone is different than other professors. Some would be like, please use contractions. Slang is just fine. Or other professors, maybe more old-fashioned professors, would say, no contractions. Use an elevated or like a deliberately intellectual diction. Don't use any humor. Humor is off limits. So it really depends upon the class, the situation that you find yourself in. But there is this issue of appropriately academic, and the academic essay should have that appropriately academic tone, whatever that means. A lot of times that connects to the question of, should we be using I? All right, should the personal pronoun be used? This is an issue of, academic writing tends to be discourse focused, right? It should be focused on the conversation, the subject of inquiry, and not on the self. A lot of times that's difficult because in the humanities, say you're writing an essay about a poem, your subjective response to that work of art is very important. So the use of the personal pronoun may be unavoidable in some contexts. But for the most part, the personal pronoun should be, in the academic context, in academic writing, should be avoided. Not at all costs. Maybe once or twice is useful, but just generally speaking, perhaps avoid, but needs to be like this rule that is never broken. Last thing I'd like to say is somebody coming from a working class background is this issue of standard academic English. A lot of times we think that standard academic English is a value judgment, like that there's an issue. This is an issue of correctness and incorrectness. And for the longest time we talked about correct English, incorrect English, and there are still going to be people who have like residual view of language in this way, that there's correct English and there's incorrect English. I think what we're moving more towards is there are different Englishes that work for different contexts. So how you use English on a text message, very different. It's almost a different, set of rules than how you would use English in an essay. So the academic essay tends to rely upon standard academic English, but I think it's important to ask questions about: is this stifling? Excuse me. Is this, forcing certain students, certain scholars to adopt a personality that to an identity that maybe isn't who they are? But I think it's fair to say that standard academic English is part of most academic writing. So final thoughts. Manuscript format is very important. It's a professional genre, so you want to have standard margins, a regularized font. You don't want to have a different font for your page numbers, different font for your body paragraphs. Same font throughout. The font should be standard. Times New Roman's fine. I think at the time of this recording, Cambria is like the standard font in Microsoft Word. Make sure that everything is formatted correctly. Make sure your essays are proofed. You want to have a clean. You don't want to have any sort of obscurity because of grammatical errors, fused sentences, subject-verb disagreement, that sort of thing. Make sure that academic conventions are observed. So if you're citing secondary sources, you should be citing those correctly, depending upon the conventions that you're following. If you're in a literary studies class like I teach, MLA format is required. Other classes like history might use footnotes in a Chicago Manual of Style, or maybe a journalism class would be using the APA, or psychology class, the APA. The final issue is plagiarism, academic dishonesty, but it's too big of an issue to get into other than to say that the academic essay is original ideas. It's original ideas. It's not stealing other people's ideas. It's your opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge, your intellectual mastery of a field, your point of view. So plagiarism is the opposite of academic writing. So that's it. Very brief introduction to the academic essay, and I hope you found it interesting.